This is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the worst maritime disaster in history, which claimed over 9,000 lives, and yet very few have ever heard of. It's me. This is my channel. And this is the Wilhelm Gustloff. In April of 1945, as Adolf Hitler's forces were being pushed back from all sides, desperate Germans were flooding towards the safety of their homeland. Among them was a mixture of soldiers, government officials, and an untold number of civilians fleeing the advancing Allies. Many hoped to escape through the Baltic Sea by any means necessary, but with Allied aircraft dominating the skies, they had to travel at night and below the surface. Across the Baltic, military and merchant vessels alike were pressed into service to ferry people away from the front lines. Few, however, were as ill-suited for the task as the Wilhelm, built in 1938 as a German ocean liner. The massive vessel was designed to carry just over 2,000 passengers between Germany and South America. Its luxurious cabins, swimming pool and grand dining halls were a far cry from the cramped conditions endured by those fleeing the war. But there was no time to argue. With most of Germany underwater, the country needed every able-bodied vessel to move what few people it could. But while the men and women aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff may have been running for their lives, they were still able to enjoy one luxury. Unlike the hellish conditions aboard most other transports, the ship was largely free of enemy fire. That was until it encountered Soviet submarine. The Wilhelm Gustloff was carrying approximately 10,000 people, mostly refugees, when it set sail from Gotenhofen, now Gdynia, in Poland, on January 30th, 1945. There should have only been about 2,000 people on board. An additional 6,000 were crammed onto another ship in the convoy. The Goya, both ships were packed way beyond capacity. Conditions on board were terrible. Food and water were scarce, and many had been forced to sleep out in the open on the top deck. As the convoy made their way across the Baltic, they were shadowed by Allied aircraft, forcing them to keep a low profile and travel under the cover of darkness. On January, after several days at sea, the convoy arrived off the coast of their destination, the port of Kiel in northern Germany. But before they could drop anchor, a lookout on the Wilhelm Gustloff spotted a pair of lights in the distance. At first, he assumed they were stars, but as they grew larger and brighter, he realized they were the eyes of a Soviet submarine. Moments later, the captain ordered the Wilhelm Gustloff to take evasive action. A loud explosion rocked the ship as a torpedo slammed into the starboard side of the Wilhelm. A second hit followed shortly after. When the torpedo struck, most of the passengers were asleep. Suddenly awoken by the chaos, they rushed to the upper decks. Many were confused as to what had happened and why the ship was listing sharply to one side. It wasn't long before they found out. As the Wilhelm Gustloff lurched violently, thousands panicked and rushed to one side of the ship, making it even more unstable. A lifeboat was scheduled for that morning, but it was cancelled due to bad weather. None of the lifeboats in the area were willing to risk the trip in the heavy seas. The nearest lifeboat was over 7 miles away. The captain ordered the remaining lifeboats to be launched and began giving orders to the crew, but there simply weren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Even if the lifeboats had been launched, the freezing cold water would have been deadly within minutes. Temperatures hovered around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind chill made it feel closer to 50 degrees below zero. Anyone who fell into the water would likely not survive the ordeal. To make matters worse, the nearby port of Kiel was blocked with ice, making a rescue attempt nearly impossible. Of the thousands of people in the water, very few would survive. Frightened passengers began leaping into the water, hoping to make it to shore. Others clung to pieces of debris in the hopes that someone would find them. Some tried to swim for land, only to have the frigid water steal their strength and numb their limbs. Within moments, The struggling swimmers became little more than human logs floating in the dark waters. A sailor aboard one of the escort vessels recalled the following: "It was like a graveyard at sea. Men, women, and children were floating about in the water, some waving their arms, others calling for help. People were floating about in odd positions, some standing up, others lying on their backs with their mouths wide open." The sailor continued, "It looked as though the whole of humanity was being exterminated. Of the roughly 10,000 people on board the Wilhelm Gustloff, very few would survive the ordeal. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly, ranging anywhere from 6,000 to upwards of 14,000 dead. The official number released by the Germans at the time was 9,400. That figure is almost certainly inflated. In reality, it's impossible to say how many people died that night. In addition to the passengers and crew of the Wilhelm Gustloff, an estimated 2,000 people lost their lives aboard the capsized Goya. Those who did survive spent hours in the freezing cold water, leading to severe frostbite and hypothermia. One survivor recalled seeing hundreds of bodies washed ashore in the days following the sinking. Most of the corpses were women and children who had been sleeping below deck when the ship sank. With the war coming to an end, the Soviets didn't release word of the tragedy, fearing it would appear as though they were targeting civilians. Likewise, the Germans were hesitant to release the news of the sinking, fearful that doing so would demoralize the public. The story of the Wilhelm Gustloff remained largely under wraps for decades. The event was all but forgotten until the fall of communism in Russia. When the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, newly declassified documents revealed the full extent of the tragedy. To this day, it remains the deadliest sinking in history, claiming over twice the lives of the Titanic. Many believe the Wilhelm Gustloff was deliberately sunk by the Soviets. However, it appears more likely that the ship was simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Germany had surrendered by the time the Soviets sank the ship, but word hadn't reached the sailors on board. If they had known, they likely would have surrendered immediately. A thorough investigation of the sinking has never been conducted, leading to countless conspiracy theories surrounding the disaster. Some believe the Soviets purposely targeted the ship, knowing that it was filled with civilians. Others claim the ship was transporting Nazi leaders and war criminals. Still, others believe there were no torpedoes involved at all, and that the ship simply cracked and broke apart due to the strain of overcrowding. However, these claims are easily disproven. There were no high-ranking Nazis on board, and passenger manifests show that the ship was completely full. Evidence also suggests that the ship was sunk by two separate torpedoes fired by the Soviet submarine. In the aftermath of the sinking, the Soviet submarine surfaced and rescued dozens of survivors, something which played a major role in keeping the story suppressed for so many years. The submarine's captain, Alexander Marinesko, received multiple medals for his actions. He would go on to sink for more German transport ships, but none would claim as many victims as the Wilhelm Gustloff. A memorial service was held on February 1945 for the victims of the sinking, but it wasn't until 1965 that a monument was erected in their honor. Since then, the site where the Wilhelm Gustloff sank has become a protected war grave. Very few artifacts from the Wilhelm Gustloff have been recovered due to the ship's great depth. However, in 2015, divers uncovered part of the ship's bell. Today, it's displayed at the German Submarine Museum in Lavow. Every year on January, locals gather at the harbor in Kiel to remember the victims of the sinking. Flowers are tossed into the water and a memorial service is held. But what do you think? Do you know of any other maritime disasters that should be remembered but have been largely forgotten? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And you can always check out more of my content here. I'll see you next time.